The opening scene starts with the credits being shown as if they were typed on a typewriter. As Solanas used an old second-hand typewriter for a lot of her work throughout the mid to late 60s, including in the writing of Scum Manifesto, the knowing audience is already being shown a juxtaposition between modern technologies of film and the more traditional forms of writing. Both forms are a valid method of storytelling, yet film at the time of the true story, in the 1960s, and even in the 1990s when I Shot Andy Warhol was released, film was considered a more relevant and successful form of art and a way of getting ideas across. This sets up the themes of juxtaposing characters of Solanas and Warhol. Solanas is seen as a creator of older art traditions, being writing and stage play, despite having radical political and societal ideas, is separated from the media overall and the pop culture icon Warhol, who deviated from these traditional notions and focused on film and replication as a way to express his art and political agenda. Despite the early setting up of this juxtaposition, it is carried throughout Harron's film as a regular theme. The first visual scene in the film is the introduction to both Solanas and Warhol. Warhol is lying on the floor bleeding, and Solanas is seen casually leaving after she shot him. The film cuts between scenes of the aftermath of Warhol being shot, hysterics of those he surrounded himself with, the police or press interviews with Solanas after the shooting, and the psychoanalysis of Solanas from the mental institution she was admitted to after these events. There is as well visual scenes from the past with a voiceover of an interview happening between a detective and the person in charge of Solanas' medical files. The cutting and merging between all these moments in time serves to position the viewer over the entirety of these events and provides an idea of the mental state of Solanas, including a contextualization of the hard upbringing and life she was faced with, the circumstances surrounding the shooting, and potentially alluding to why she chose to shoot Warhol. These scenes set up the story reimagined by Harron, giving an unbiased view of the historical event. In Shooting Solanas, Radical Feminist History and the Technology of Failure by Dana Heller, it is mentioned the fictional film was produced with a painstakingly researched, meticulously detailed, partially imagined account of the events leading up to the botched assassination attempt on Warhol, but also that in researching, Harron found herself frustrated by the lack of evidence in Solanas' existence. Through the use of Scum Manifesto and the information obtained by Harron, she was able to piece together a story which provides a documentary-style element to the fictional film. There is an importance in Harron's adaptation to add to a history that was not easily found before. In Linda Hutchins' A Theory of Adaptation, she says, it makes little sense to talk about adaptations as historically accurate or historically inaccurate in the usual sense. In other words, it is a paraphrase or translation of a particular other text, a particular interpretation of history. In reference to I Shot Andy Warhol, even with the true factual events and stories being adapted, as well as correctly quoting Scum Manifesto, there is allusion to faithfulness to the source, while still being Harron's interpretation of these historical events, to give an account of the queer scene in the 1960s. The film's setting is based in New York City in the 1960s. The locations included regular places that Solanas frequented in her lifetime, as discovered by Harron. The hotels she stayed at, Warhol's factory, and interactions with space around New York City were all crucial in telling the story of Solanas, her relation to Warhol, and many other characters featured in the film. As the film was originally to be a documentary, the settings used are relatively faithful to the spaces in the recreation of the story without having any actual footage from the events. As the film focuses on an adaptation of real-life events, including Scum Manifesto, there is a slight obligation in keeping the setting faithful to the events to be able to give a truthful credit to the story. There is no original source text in this case, rather a collection of stories and sources to find information on to adapt into the film. In the literal adaptation of Scum Manifesto to screen, Harron uses scenes where Solanas is reading from her original script, direct to the audience in black and white, lit up by a spotlight directing attention solely onto the readings from the novel. It encourages a reenactment of the emotions and passion behind Solanus when writing the manifesto, as well as showing the important influence this text had on the film. This is a deliberate choice made by Harron that insinuates elements of a physical page, again stressing the importance of the manifesto. The importance of this accuracy in I Shot Andy Warhol is to offer the viewer a more holistic representation of queer spaces in the 1960s and a revisiting for the viewer to make up their own opinions surrounding the history of Solanus and Warhol.
In the Archive of Lesbian Feelings by Anne Svetkovic, Anne draws attention to the struggles of forging a lesbian cultural memory due to the queer experience often being represented in gay bars or clubs. In this film, as Caitlin mentioned, we see a more holistic representation of queer space. This being said, Solanus is almost constantly being relocated, whether it is her trying to find a new accommodation or being kicked out of a space. While you were watching the film, did you feel as though there were any welcoming queer spaces for Solanus?
A key theme in the film is Andy's control over Valerie. In Valerie's own words, "He had too much control over my life." Even though Andy is not in majority of scenes, he dominates the film as an overbearing character in Valerie's life. The first point in which the audience is enforced that Andy is to be a key figure in the quest for Valerie's publicity is when Candy states, "If anyone can make you a star, Andy can." From this moment onwards, her fixation with getting her play script to Andy begins. This obsession is something Andy uses to capitalize on for his own profit and pleasure. This capitalization is shown through tasks Andy requests of Valerie. He is shown probing her to monologue for him and to be shot in his screen tests and upcoming films. Harron further depicts the control over Valerie through the juxtaposition of responses when conversing with one another and via the setting of where the conversations between them take place. All conversations occur in Andy's main place of work, the factory. Valerie is seen to be always coming to him with proposals, which are never reciprocated. When proposing that he start production on her play, she is met with a shrug and a blank stare. This blank expression becomes familiar to the audience throughout the film. This showing the audience that she is constantly being examined and observed like one of his experiments or art projects. As Valerie's motives for shooting Andy are not directly described in the film, it was important for Harron to strongly portray the control Andy had over her. This to help the audience make sense of Valerie's motivation behind the shooting.
In the preface written for Scum Manifesto and in the opening sequence of the film, attempts are made to inform us about the complexity of Solanus' interactions. We're informed about the sexual abuse she endured as a child, her academic triumphs, her deteriorating mental health, and her violent actions. In the film, this information is delivered through relevant authority figures, such as a mental health care professional, a police officer, and a letter of appraisal from a high school principal, using these perspectives to validate this information for us. The incorporation of this knowledge through various perspectives also works to create a more complex and empathetic vision of her and her work. Her actions are just not that of a mentally ill woman or a reaction to her past, nor are they just purely intellectual. Just as Solanus is vague about her reasons for shooting Andy Warhol, so is the film. It reserves judgment which allows us to make our own. The film represents a lot of queer icons such as Andy Warhol or Candy Darling, and what we see in the intimate moments we have with these characters is that the film shies away from glamorizing any of them or constructing them as these perfect queer icons or voices, which also feeds into this kind of objective tone that Harron sustains throughout the piece. This can be seen when we watch Candy cry after the transphobic insults hurled at her by Solanus. One thing to consider when looking at an adaptation of a queer text is that the queer community often suffers from a lack of recorded history or cultural memory. What adaptations have the ability to do is to forge this memory into the collective memory. I Shot Andy Warhol serves as a counter-memory to what the media and Warhol documented at the time, which was that Solanus' violence was a shot at fame. The film can also be viewed as a kind of archive of information and sources we have of Solanus. Anne Svetkovic in the Archive of Lesbian Feelings talks about the benefits of documenting queer history through archives, which goal should be not to just document the dates, but to include pictures and materials that hold emotional value. She also discusses the role visual media plays in making these archives accessible and the importance of representing a history of feeling rather than trying to make a unified experience of the past. I Shot Andy Warhol is very emotionally charged, and it offers us this vision of what it looks like to be a queer individual in the 60s and testifies to the experience of trauma within popular culture, using postmodern prestige as a means of thinking about history.
In Solanus' own words, she summarized her manifesto as a two-part treatise, the first part being an analysis of male psychology, and the second part being a what to do about it response. As Dana Heller articulates, Harron's representation of the Scum Manifesto in I Shot Andy Warhol focuses more on the violent prospects of the what to do about it, rather than the analytical qualities of Solanus' analysis of male psychology. This helps to portray the more radical ideas lying within the character of Valerie in her film. Harron decides to show the violence behind Valerie's ideology through the intentional creation of the acronym SCUM, Society for Cutting Up Men. This is shown in the rooftop scene in which Valerie is intentionally typing and describing the acronym as the title. Although Harron depicts the creation of the title in this way, there is no reliable evidence that Solanus intended SCUM to stand as the acronym for Society for Cutting Up Men. As Heller describes, one source suggests that Solanus never intended SCUM as an acronym at all. In 1975, Jane Caputi, the now Professor of Women's Studies at Florida International University, Eileen Kane, and Susan Cavan interviewed Solanus in New York City. The interview was never published, but Caputi recalls Solanus' insistence that the acronym Society for Cutting Up Men was the fabrication of her publisher Maurice Girardis.